glad to see some familiar faces here. For those of you who haven't been in one of my sessions before, my name is Dr. Nate Poling. I'm an instructional consultant here at the Center for Teaching Excellence, and we serve the entire university. So, Cutter, Galveston, and Dallas-Fort Worth, and then Kingsville, and also where I'm heading later on in the week, McAllen. So all of those are part of Texas A&M here at College Station, and we serve all instructors and faculty there. So very excited to be with you today. Without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about some of the outcomes from this session. Definitely want to help you identify ways to help learners recognize and address biases and assumptions. We'll get more into that in just a little bit, because I think addressing the barriers to critical thinking is really key. We're also going to identify some teaching and learning approaches that can help learners develop more effective critical thinking approaches. So I don't think any of the stuff that I'm going to share with you today is earth-breaking or earth-shattering, but hopefully it is something that you'll be able to kind of learn or affirm. So with that being said, definitely hope that you can learn something new today. And if you already know the stuff that we're going to cover, I definitely hope that it affirms what you're already doing. So learn and affirm are the 2 words of the day. First things first, I am going to ask you to kind of take out a sheet of paper and a writing utensil of your choice, or you could have a device of your choice. But I do think it's important to help take notes or jot down ideas that you might have or questions that you might have, because I think that really helps you get much more out of the session that way. And it also kind of gives you a reference point as we keep going. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to kind of jot down 3 things that you find interesting in the session. What are 3 things that you find interesting or new in the session, or that have been affirmed for you? Secondly, I want you to jot down 2 things that you still have questions about. So what are 2 questions that you still have after the session that you might want to email me about or ask me about? And then finally, I want you to kind of focus on what is one thing that you can definitely take with you and apply it in your own teaching and learning, either later this semester, next week perhaps, or sometime later on when you're teaching, maybe next semester or in the fall of this coming academic year. So let me go ahead and enable the live transcriptions. So if you don't want to see the transcriptions, you can go to your Zoom bar and hit hide transcripts, and that will mute the transcripts for you. But I'm going to go ahead and keep them on because some people like them on, and it could be helpful. So 3 things that you find new, interesting, 2 things that you still have questions about, and 1 thing that you might want to implement later on in the near future. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to flag me down in the chat or anything like that. So I did want to say that this session is an hour long, so there's no way that I can go ahead and do a microscopic view of everything. So we're looking at a high-level overview, looking at some concepts, some approaches, some mindfulness approaches that we can kind of think about critical thinking. It's not a deep dive. So if you want a deep dive, one of my other hats here at the university is consulting. So we can definitely set up a time to chat in detail, in depth about specific context, subjects, assignments, assessments, things like that. So there is an opportunity for you to do that. You can reach me at inpoling@tamu.edu, and I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. So if you want an individual consultation, we can then go with that. So we are looking at a higher level overview today. This is Wonder Woman, and I like to start this off because the first thing I really want to talk about isn't the movie, but it's wonder. And I think wonder can be a key linchpin when it comes to getting students engaged in the critical thinking process. Because you have to interest students, you have to get their attention before they can really put their full mental capacity, behind what they're doing. So, simple definition of wonder is to be in a state of wonder, to feel curiosity or doubt. I think that curiosity piece is really key. And one of the simplest teaching tools that I use with my own students and with my 20-month-old son is this very simple construct of asking questions. because he likes to point at things and ask questions with his eyes. He doesn't speak yet. So he notices stuff, and then he has, wonders about things. So I think one of the simplest teaching methods or approaches could be, what do you notice about a certain situation? What do you notice about a certain image or situation, and what do you wonder about it? Because I think a lot of times we go from notice to voicing our opinion, and that's not always the most proactive thing to do. So getting students to notice and to wonder is a built-in mechanism to kind of, discourage students from jumping to the conclusions right away. And we'll talk about more of the problem space and the solution space later, but I think it's very important to kind of get our students to think, to notice, and to wonder. So I'm going to ask you, what do you notice and what do you wonder about this image that I'm showing you here? You can go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can say something over voice, but what do you notice and what do you wonder about this, this image here? They're green, yes. Mona asks, why are they tabletops only 2D? Are these the same size? Yan asks, noticing the different views. Okay, two-dimensionality. So if I did this workshop in person, the very interesting thing is I actually hand people a printout of this and a pair of scissors. And believe it or not, you can go online and find the image. But what happens is if you cut out the rectangles or the parallelograms, they are actually the same size. If you don't believe me, after this, go ahead and do it, and you'll find that it's true. So right away, getting people to notice, and what do you wonder? You noticed and wondered about this, but now how can we kind of move on to the next step? So if I was teaching this, I would actually have you do it. So again, getting people's attention, getting them to notice, and getting them to wonder. My question is which is healthier? This on the screen here, or this? Which do you think is healthier? The Big Mac or the chicken green salad? Raul says both unhealthy, but which is the most unhealthy? Tiana says slightly healthier, the salad. Hamburgers. So if you go by calorie count at McDonald's, actually the chicken salad has more calories, more salt, more fat, and more sugar than the Big Mac, which I think is kind of funny. So there are several things that you can notice and you can wonder about, that we're going to talk about today. So getting into that observer stage, getting into that, curiosity stage. What flag is this? Is it Chile or is it Texas? So what flag is this? So this one's Texas, this one's Chile. Okay. So even with our audience here, there's still a little bit of confusion. So they're very similar. What flag is this? Okay, Melissa says the pride flag. Okay, then what is this flag? Okay, this is if this is the pride flag, what flag is this? If this is the pride flag, then what is this one? So very similar. I'm going to tell you the answer. So this flag here, the one that is on the screen, is actually the flag of Cusco, Peru. Jane, right? You're right. This is the pride flag. The difference is the baby blue. Well, I was in 2019. I actually went to Peru and visited Cusco and Machu Picchu, and this flag was everywhere. So at first, I thought this is the most pride-friendly city, but then I did a little more research and realized that this was because of the sun god. It's their mythology. So again, very, 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 very similar. But some of us might have been a little confused to this. Raul should have known that. Okay, you're a bad Peruvian and a bad Texan. Okay, well, it's a safe space here. We won't share that everywhere. But what I'm trying to get you to think about, and it's going to be a little more evident later on, is our powers of observation can really help get us thinking critically. What do you notice about the FedEx logo? Say the orange EX, the arrow. How many of you had never noticed the arrow before? So this is a sharp group. A lot of times people have never noticed the arrow before. So some things are hiding in plain sight. Some things are very similar. but it really takes a lot of noticing and wondering to kind of get down to the bottom of it. What about Amazon? I order from Amazon way more often than I should, but what do you notice here? Okay, Jim, you say A to Z and then smile in the arrow. So yes, I've used this example quite a bit, but how many of you noticed the A to Z or missed it? How many of you noticed the smiley face? Yeah, so I think not everyone saw both of those, but now you do. Okay, Melissa, now you know the A to Z. So at least you've learned something here today, and the smiley face, yes. All right, well, Starbucks, what do you notice? Something's different or off about this Starbucks logo. You've probably never noticed it. Okay, there's a star. What else? It does look like the Sydney Opera House. There's a split tail. And I'm looking for something else. So what do you notice about this image and what do you wonder? Okay, no pupils. What if I pointed out to you that on the right-hand side, the eye or the nose isn't symmetrical? The Starbucks logo is not symmetrical. And up until a few years ago, I thought they were mirror images. How many of you didn't notice that? Okay, so the story goes is that the Starbucks people who were creating the logo thought that symmetry would probably look too automated, too mechanical. So they added a touch of humanity to the Starbucks logo, which they made it a little asymmetrical, which I thought was pretty interesting. But we wouldn't have taken that into account unless we noticed, or if we examined, or if we wondered. So definitely these exercises do have a point. But I do want to talk about critical thinking a little bit. In your own words, with your own definition, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to type your definition of critical thinking. Could be your discipline, could be something, your favorite definition, but what is your definition of critical thinking? Give you about 30 seconds. Thinking outside the box, analytical thinking, practice of analyzing a problem from different angles. Okay, different angles is good. Synthesizing information from multiple perspectives, evaluating the information. Great, great. Analytic thinking to see different perspectives. I see perspectives here. Observing and orienting to data and evaluating without bias, definitely. So I went with a simpler definition. All of yours are correct. Critical thinking, according to dictionary.com, is disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. And from the Oxford Dictionary, the process of analyzing information in order to make a logical decision about the extent to which you believe something to be true or false. So I don't know about you, but in my personal experience, both of my undergraduate students and my graduate students and PhD students, sometimes subjectivity and other things come in the way of critically thinking about a situation or a problem or a case study or an experiment or things like that. So, critical thinking is an area that a lot of times our students need help with. And to be honest with you, I don't think a lot of times our students have been taught to critically think. There have been times when I've assumed that my students are well-versed in these skills and have been proven wrong. So I've had to go back and help teach those skills. So I think it's important for us to kind of keep that in mind too. I'm going to pause here for a second. Is there any comments, questions that anyone would like to posit or share? All right, well, let's keep going. Again, you can interrupt me in the chat if you need to. So there are a lot of barriers or potential barriers when it comes to our students and critical thinking. And one of them, of course, is information overload. So, information overload can definitely be an issue, can be something that's a challenge. And sometimes it leads to shortcuts in decision making and things like that. One of the other things that sometimes our students, run into barriers with are opinions. How do you distinguish opinion from fact? And how do you set your own opinions aside to more objectively think about a certain situation or a certain concept? So those are some things that our students might be struggling with. The other thing could be their beliefs, their values, their habits, the way they feel, the way they think, the way they do things, and the way that their attitudes all play out. So all of these things can be things that are barriers to critical thinking when it comes to our students. Now, you as instructors probably know this, but I'm not so sure that our students know this. So, whenever working with undergrad or even graduate students, I would make it a point to kind of go over some of these things if you don't already, because I think that could be a key to kind of, helping them understand that they see the world through different lenses, and to be more objective and to be better critical thinkers, they have to recognize these lenses and adjust accordingly. The other thing that is a barrier to student critical thinking could be expectations, false or too high or lofty expectations. Could be expectations on part of the instructor or on part of the student, or mutual expectations. That could be challenging. The other thing, and then some of you noted in your description or your definition, was bias. Bias can play a part in this, and that's another big issue or big challenge our students face when critically thinking. I think that's true a lot of times across the disciplines, across the university. The other thing that I think might not be a challenge, but provides a nuance to their critical thinking, is everyone has a different perspective. Everyone has different experiences. Everyone has different lenses, like I've spoken about. And I think as instructors, as educators, one of the ways to help our students become better critical thinkers and less biased and less, assuming, is to, understand a little bit more about themselves. And, for you to understand a little bit more about yourself, because we're all coming to the table with biases, with assumptions. And I think it's not realistic to expect our students to automatically be objective, because these things do mean a lot to them. It's part of their identity. It's part of your identity. But what I'm proposing is, addressing these head on, acknowledging the fact that we have differences and similarities, because it can go a long way when it comes to, being on the same page when it comes to critically think. So again, self-identity with yourself and with students, I think, is important. I think sometimes, at least observing my students, they only think of or see the world through their own lens, or through a very specific lens. And I think your definitions of critical thinking, a lot of you had other perspectives. So I know it seems to be kind of commonly known that you need to be objective or more objective when it comes to critically thinking, but I think a lot of times our students aren't prepared necessarily to do that. So I guess kind of addressing that head on could be a good pedagogical way to getting them to the spot or the phase where you want them to be. One thing that I wanted to kind of share with you, I found very helpful, and let me go ahead and exit out of this. Hang on a second. I'm going to go ahead and put this in the chat. Is this the best infographic out there? I don't know, but I found it helpful. So I encourage you to kind of take a couple of minutes to look at this. Is there something that was new to you? I went through these 50 cognitive biases, and I kind of had to look at myself and say, I've been guilty of that before. So I include this in here because I think this could be very helpful in knocking down or addressing some of the barriers to student critical thinking. Sometimes our students come in with what they call fundamental attribution error. Maybe they come in with groupthink, or maybe they didn't even know what the label was. Yes, Dorothy, the curse of knowledge is one of the biggest ones that I've seen. Robbie, that's a very good question. Depending on your context, it could be, one of the barriers of critical thinking are assumptions and biases. Let's talk about some assumptions and biases that might cloud your scientific thought process or your critical thinking skills. It could be just direct like that. I know that a lot of my students might have had a anchoring bias. Look at this anchoring bias here. We rely heavily on the first piece of information introduced when making decisions. So when I was working with undergrads, research entailed going to Google and taking the first one or two things that came up in Google, the Google search. So, you can integrate maybe the first piece of information you reach isn't necessarily the most robust. I think another one is, let's see here. Confirmation bias is another big one. Now, you don't have to share all 50 with your students, but I think if you can, kind of pick 3 or 4 or 5 of the most common ones that you see with your students, and then actually speak about them and talk about it, that could go a long way in helping with clearing their minds when it comes to biases and critical thinking. Yes, the Dunning-Kruger effect. And then we also have outgroup homogeneity. We perceive outgroup members as homogeneous and our own groups as more diverse. So some of these biases are probably more prevalent within social science and education, and some might be more prevalent in the hard sciences, but I do think that there's overlap. Yes, zero risk bias. Authority bias is a very interesting one. My grad student is a first generation college student working on a second master's, and they said that authority bias with first generation students, especially BIPOC students, authority bias is a big deal because they're trained and conditioned to accept authority regardless of the fact. So authority bias could play to certain demographics a little heavier than others. So you have other ones down here. We're going to actually kind of revisit this in a little bit, but I wanted to keep going. So let me go ahead and go back to the slideshow. So I think it's important for us to kind of address these, note these, before we even get into teaching about critical thinking. But I think it's also important to kind of help our students think about the problem space and the solution space. So here's my question to you. When you assign a problem, whether it's physics or STEM related, or whether it's education or sociology or social science related, when you assign them this or give them a situation or case study, where do your students go first? Which space do they go first? Do you see? Yeah, you say they go directly to solution space. Anyone else? Okay. Mona, you say your students do that too. Anyone else? Hey, Richard, do you agree? Susan? Now, in my experience, it's also true with faculty. A lot of times, I think it's human nature to want to solve a problem without fully defining the problem. So I think that this acronym, I found it on a consulting website. It's very nice. It's you can divide the problem space and the solution space so that students are forced to spend more time in the problem space. And I think that's where a lot of the critical thinking happens. I think a lot of times our students short circuit this sort of procedure and go directly to solution space without adequately and critically thinking about the solution itself. So they're jumping to conclusions. Cindy, exactly right. Skipping the lab to get to findings, conclusions, implications. Yeah, not skipping the process in many regards, coming to a solution without fully engaging in the process. So I think by paying special attention to slowing the problem solving, the critical thinking process down is key to helping our students become better critical thinkers. Raul, yeah, the problem space could be passive, but I like how this model here makes the problem space a more active space too, because you're briefing, you're thinking about the problem, you're talking about the problem, then you're researching about the problem, you're informing yourself more about the problem, you're immersing yourself in the problem. So those are all active things, I think, that our students oftentimes skip, because honestly, doing the background research isn't the most fun or engaging, but I think there are ways to kind of build it in to be so it's more immersive. And it's only after you brief, research, and immerse yourself in the problem, then you can get to the generate, harvest, and get your top ideas. So I think that slowing students down, keeping them kind of grounded within the problem space before they reach the solution space and providing guidance that way could be a good way to kind of help slow the process down and outline it for them a little more clearly. Richard, you say you force your students to tell me the problem they're trying to solve with cover. Yes. So you're following that. You're forcing your students to be in the problem space. The problem space causes a lot of frustration sometimes, and sometimes our students don't like engaging with that frustration. So I think it's important that engaging them in the problem space, but also making a safe environment for them to fail and struggle with that problem is key. So, from a teaching and learning perspective, people learn best when they've had to wrestle with a problem, when they've had to kind of engage with the material before they jump to a solution. Exactly, Jane. Why does the problem exist? Getting our students to ask those questions. What do you wonder about the problem? What do you notice about the problem before you get to how do we solve the problem? So I think breaking that down can be helpful. So now we're going to actually put this into action. And I have a little scenario here that I want you in groups to kind of wrestle with. And what the scenario is, you're about to teach a unit on global warming and its effects on global and local politics, socioeconomic dynamics, inequity, and resource disparity. So pretty realistic if you're in a certain field. Please put on a hat of disbelief if you're not in this field, play along. You know that this will probably be a very challenging unit to teach your second-year students, in major and non-major. How would you prepare to teach this unit? Maybe knowing that your students are going to automatically go to jumping to solution space. What are some approaches that you would use to help develop your students' critical thinking skills? And what are some biases that you think students may bring to the table? And how can we help them navigate this tricky landscape? So I'm going to let you all wrestle with this for a little bit. We're going to come back. I'm going to show you some resources that I've compiled, and then we're going to debrief, and then we'll be done for the day. But I'm going to go ahead and put you in groups here. And we're going to be in groups for about 13 minutes. And I'm going to hop into each group. But I really want you to wrestle with this problem, because I think it's important. It's a situation that requires a lot of critical thinking skills on a lot of different levels, but it's also a situation that's ripe for biases and assumptions. So how would you, as a group, based on your own experiences, address this? So I'm going to go ahead and open all the rooms, and then we will kind of reconvene in about 13 minutes, and I'll give you some suggestions, some approaches after that. So here we go, and I will visit each room.
Before we could even present this question to the students, is that we were going to have to check our own biases, because one of the things that was kind of pointed out is that a poorly constructed question, or a question that includes our own biases, is pretty much either going to direct the conversation or might actually just shut down the conversation completely. So we'd have to check our own biases before we could even start to plan that, start to plan the unit and what we might do in there.
Yes, thank you, Mona. I think, like I mentioned before, we as instructors and educators have our own biases and assumptions and lenses. And if we're not careful, that can translate to how we design and how we have learning assessments and things like that. Grace says you like to start with an activity that allows students to share what they already know or think. Yes, I think that's an excellent kind of starting off point. Gives them a little bit more of a chance to kind of share. Anyone else in another group want to share what they discussed or came up with?
Just because it was a great conversation too. And so basically, we recognize that this is a little bit of a contentious topic. And so taking your wonderful advice, Nate, we decided to let them spend more time in the problem space and actually say, okay, let's look at the problem, let's break it up into smaller pieces, and let's look at the problem and the effects globally. So that if somebody has a bias that's, a Western bias, well, then they need to investigate what the impact in different regions and what they see there. And so to broaden their own knowledge before they even plunge forward in it. And so we brought that idea up, and also, maybe asking them to have a civil discussion of opposing views in it before they, got too much further in it. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for that. That's excellent. Spending more time in the problem space. And then Dorothy, you say, classical rhetorical practice of ask questions to argue both sides. So if you notice, I put a PDF into the chat because when we talk about dialogue, discussion, and debate, we want to make sure that it stays civil and that it doesn't devolve into a free-for-all. So I provided a resource that I've actually used with my undergraduate and graduate students to kind of help frame difficult discussions and dialogues that we have. So I hope that you find that helpful. Every group doesn't have to share, but is there anyone else that would like to kind of talk a little bit about what they kind of discussed?
So we had a lot of really great ideas in our group, from, providing. So I think it was one individual said they taught tourism, and they actually start the class out with saying, how not great tourism is, and the students are kind of taken aback, and then provide videos about people who are in the countries where we tour a lot, or cities like Venice, where we talk about how it actually impacts the people who live there on a daily basis.
Sure.
So, providing, videos, case studies of opposing views, role playing, having, I think someone said, looking at opposite opinions, but maybe asking students to defend an opinion that's opposite of their own.
Yeah.
Having them write policies. And then I think one individual also said about how we frame the question may reveal the assumptions that we already have. And so even having that kind of discussion.
Thank you for sharing, Jane. So one of the key things that I'm trying to get across is before we can even teach our students about critical thinking, we have to kind of address this other thing, because we can have the best lesson that is designed to help them critically think, but if they can't get over addressing their own biases and assumptions and only seeing the problem through their own lens, then no amount of critical thinking instruction is really going to help. So I think addressing that is key. I see in the chat, debates, dialogue is good. I think kind of seeing both sides is good. I'm going to go ahead and give you a couple of things that I think would be helpful. Again, our students sometimes struggle between fact and fiction and what are alternative facts. So getting them to, to kind of be more critically evaluating the resources that they use is key. I shared with you the debate, discussion, dialogue. I've actually shared this with students and faculty, and it really helps frame our discussion a little better. It's more productive that way. Kind of even talking about whataboutism. I think that can be a fruitful discussion, because a lot of times if you get into a dialogue or debate, students might not critically think through it. They might just revert to whataboutism. And that's something that you might want to kind of address head on. One other thing that works both in the hard sciences, social sciences, I'm sorry, let me take that back. In sciences or in STEM or in education is engaging students in the metacognitive process. How are you thinking? Why are you thinking? And why you do think the way you do? Because it's easy to have opinions. It's easy to have your own biases. But why are you thinking the way you're thinking? How can you reevaluate the way you're thinking? If you're approaching a problem a certain way, whether it's a case study or scenario or an experiment or a formula, why isn't it working, or why is it working? Or why am I coming to this conclusion? So getting students to ask why, getting students to wonder, what do they notice? What do they wonder is key. I think that's engaging in them in this process isn't easy, because they like to go to the black and white answer. But I think, teaching them to kind of go through the metacognitive cycle is key. The other thing I like to kind of look at is going back to how you design your instruction. Sometimes we're not teaching critical thinking because our learning outcomes are too basic. Maybe they're not on a high enough level of Bloom's taxonomy. So I like the Iowa State University's Bloom taxonomy because it has a cognitive process dimension and it has a knowledge dimension. And I'll share the slides with everyone. But I find that using this really helps with course design and activity design. And again, I'll share this. These are just more verbs that can help stimulate more discussion and deeper level thinking. And then also, I like to call this the bookend lecture. Breaking up your lecture can help with critical thinking, because you're giving them chunks of information and then asking them to kind of actually do something with the information. So even how you structure your class and deliver your material can help with critical thinking, because if you just go 40-minute lecture and then a 20-minute discussion time, that's a lot of listening. It's not a lot of talking, not a lot of engaging in critical thinking. So these little areas of critical thinking can really help students internalize what they're learning. Things that you can intersperse things are very simple. Think, pair, share. You're going over the material. You ask students to pause, to think about it. Then you ask them to pair up or work in trios, and then they share. And you can pair this with polling technology or whatnot. That's something you can do. Another thing that really helps with critical thinking, or possibly can, is the jigsaw approach. This is where you have students in groups, and each of them is assigned a number. So 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or 6, and then all of the ones go to a table, all the twos go to a table. And then, each of the students becomes an expert in that area that they're going to learn about. And then you bring them back to the home group, and their job is to teach the information to all the students that weren't in there. So, number 1 is going to teach about what they discussed with the group of number 1s, and so forth. And what this does is it actually forces students to teach what they learned. And I don't know about you, but I know I've learned it when I can teach and show other people in my peer group what I've learned. So sometimes teaching is a great way to kind of engage them in critical thinking, because it forces them to internalize it, to think things through, because they're in charge of sharing that information. The other thing is a muddiest point. So, after today's lecture, what are some of the questions that you have? Why do you have those questions? Let's come back next week, and we'll kind of unpack those questions. So, engaging them in the metacognitive process in all of 3 of these activities can be very beneficial. The other thing that I wanted to touch on real quick is growth mindset. This concept has been out there quite a bit. I want to stress the fact that growth mindset isn't about, just perseverance. It's about critically thinking about things. So it's not a growth mindset for me to keep working on something and persevering, but still doing the same thing and failing. The true growth mindset is trying something, engaging in the metacognitive process to improve what I'm trying to do, and then kind of going through that iterative process. So I think that that's where I'm gonna leave you at, because we're almost out of time. But I wanted to ask if you had any questions or comments before we head out for the day. I hope this was a useful exercise for you. Hopefully you were able to learn some new things. Hopefully you were able to kind of affirm a few things. If you have questions, please definitely let me know. I'm available for individual consultations, but we're at 2 o'clock and I want to be mindful of your time. So thank you for joining us.